Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Today we are doing the long-awaited unarmed tier list because a lot of people have been asking me for this, but unfortunately unarmed weapons are at the very bottom of, well, kind of everything in New Vegas. Not necessarily the worst weapons by any means, because a lot of them are really, really strong, and unarmed honestly is probably one of the strongest starting skills in the entire game and stays consistently strong throughout the entire game. So let's talk about each of these weapons. First up we have our bare hands as well as boxing tape. I don't really have a thing for bare hands here, so I'm just going to roll it into one with boxing tape because I feel like they're kind of close enough to talk about, although they are fairly different. Your bare hands don't weigh anything, which makes them very unique in that way, as well as you always have them on you in any sort of situation, so you can always punch stuff with your bare fists. That's not necessarily always the best idea to do, but it's an idea that you can do in New Vegas, and it's actually fairly effective if you get your unarmed skill high enough, as well as if you have certain perks like Super Slam or Paralyzing Palm, which makes unarmed weapons extremely scary, as well as having other things like Piercing Strike to just ignore armor, and Purifier to punch Deathclaws and other abominations. There's a lot that can go for it, although your bare fists are going to be your last option, unless you're doing a challenge run of either you can't use any weapons and you're just going to be using your two fisticuffs here, or you're going to be, I guess, having a no weight challenge or something, which I have thought about doing. Your bare hands would be an option there. So, bare hands I would probably put into D tier, and kind of talking about that, we have boxing tape, which has a 0 unarmed skill requirement and 1 strength requirement. You can wield this with anybody. This has low damage per hit, low damage per second, low crit damage, a low crit modifier. Has very low weight though, only coming in at a quarter weight, so it can be cut in half even further if you have Pack Rat. And its action point costs are fine. VATS actually helps a lot with melee and unarmed. This also has the unique ability of inflicting the fatigue damage. Fatigue damage is a buildup of fatigue on an enemy until it just collapses. That can actually be pretty useful, especially towards enemies that aren't dealing really high damage, or if you're wearing heavy armor to where they can't deal really high damage because your armor is protecting you. Boxing tape, I'm still probably going to put into the D tier though. It's not really a weapon that you want to be using with unarmed, at least for serious fights. However, it's not bad to keep on your person if you just want to use it for clearing up small enemies, because the amount of health that boxing tape has is a lot. It actually has 500 health, which is a huge amount for unarmed or melee. It's actually a huge amount even for guns. It takes forever to actually break boxing tape. It's also super common, so it's not even a bad thing to be picking up and just to carry around. Again, it only weighs a quarter weight, so walking around with it and just punching stuff, small things, works really, really well for this. Moving on to our second weapon, we have boxing gloves, which may or may not be an improvement over boxing tape, because they also require 0 unarmed and 1 strength, so same requirement as boxing tape, although they do even less damage per hit, low damage per second, very low crit damage at only 1, so it's similar to like an explosive weapon build. They do have low action point costs, and they do also inflict the fatigue status, same way the boxing tape does, although a little bit more. These also weigh quite a bit more at 6, which is kind of surprising. Boxing gloves are also fairly common to find early on, and they have pretty good item health. Mostly you're just going to be using this to punch small things to death, or again in combination with very strong perks for unarmed. Outside of that, boxing gloves aren't really the best unarmed weapon, but I do like that they're included into New Vegas, and I would probably put them into the D tier, same with the boxing tape. Then we move on to the unique version of boxing gloves, which is the golden gloves. You can find these inside the Lucky 38, you can get them inside the lobby, and these ones also require 0 unarmed and 1 strength. They have low damage per second, a 2 times crit modifier, although they do have still 1 crit damage like regular boxing gloves. They do have decent action point costs, and they inflict 50 fatigue per hit. This actually helps them out quite a bit, as well as they have more health than the regular boxing gloves. So punching enemies, at least regular and smaller enemies, again, is not a bad option here. It's just I don't really find myself going for boxing gloves in a unarmed build, or the golden gloves in an unarmed build. They're not terrible by any means. You can get through with them, and I would say that these are better than the regular boxing gloves, so I think I'm going to put them into C tier. But still, they're not going to be a weapon that I really seek out and go for when I could just take boxing tape to kind of do the same sort of job. But as a direct comparison of a 1-to-1 weapon, I would say it's a little bit better than boxing tape just because the fatigue damage is quite a bit better. Up next, we have brass knuckles. Brass knuckles are probably one of the first unarmed weapons that you can find as well. These ones require 25 unarmed and 2 strength to wield. These ones have pretty decent damage per hit. They're actually really good early on. Pretty good damage per second as well in the early game. Crit chance is normal, crit damage is normal. Action point cost is pretty low, which is really good. And they have high item health for an unarmed or a melee weapon. These ones are actually really, really good if you're doing a dedicated melee build. because if you find them early on enough, they can carry you quite a ways, and they're not going to break super fast. I would say that this one is probably like C tier overall for an unarmed weapon. However, in the early game, they're much higher. They're probably like an A tier weapon for the early game, and one of the best unarmed weapons that you can get, or melee weapons you can get. They will get outshined by something like Chance's Knife, which you can get immediately at the start, and they'll also get outshined by our upcoming 2 weapons here. But for what they are, brass knuckles are pretty decent. You can also sneak these in. You can sneak in like boxing tape. I don't think you can sneak into boxing gloves. I could be wrong about that. These also only weigh 1, so you can cut it in half with Pack Rat, which is pretty cool. Then up next, we got spike knuckles. These are just a direct upgrade to brass knuckles. These ones require 50 unarmed and 3 strength to wield, so a little bit higher than brass knuckles, but still not too bad. They do pretty good damage per hit, pretty high damage per second. Crit chance and crit damage is average. Action point cost is very low, which is great, and these have even higher health than the regular brass knuckles. The spike knuckles are awesome if you can get them early on, and they are probably one of the best unarmed / melee weapons in the game at the start. Again, Chance's Knife is still going to take the top spot, but these ones are probably in the top 3, I would say. Top 3 to 5, depending on what you're counting as early game and what you can grab right away. Spike knuckles are really, really good. So, in the early game, again, probably A tier. They do kind of fall out of favor once you get some of these other unarmed weapons because they are really strong. But I think I'm still going to put it A tier on the lower end, though. Not necessarily at the top end of A tier, but when you can get them, very, very good. You can also sneak them into places, and then they're very strong, too. And then up next, we have the unique versions. These are Love and Hate. Love and Hate you can get very early on, too, if you're willing to go through the passage to the north of Good Springs, where you go up through there's a bunch of Cazadors, and then there is a town on the other end of it. I think it's called Bonnie Springs, where you have to take these off of one of the leaders. She is fairly tough because she's got plasma grenades, and she's got combat armor, and there's another raider boss there that has metal armor, and he's got a trail carbine, so it's a rough fight at the early game. But if you can pick these off, these ones are really, really good early game weapons. These require 50 unarmed and 3 strength. This does good damage per hit, really good damage per second, has an average crit modifier, has decent crit damage, has low action point cost, has a lot of health. These ones you can also sneak into places. These ones are fantastic, and I would put them up into A tier. I think that they are really good. They do fall out of favor later on into the game because some of the other unarmed weapons get really crazy, but hey, they're pretty good for what you get early on. Up next, we have the Dog Tag Fists. The Dog Tag Fist is kind of a weird weapon because you actually have to make this. You have to get 20 NCR dog tags to make it, as well as a schematic to make it, and the schematic is kind of out of the way if you want to get it. This one requires 0 unarmed and 1 strength. This one does okay damage per hit, okay damage per second, has an average crit modifier, has average crit damage, kind of high action point cost, so it's not really that great in a VATS build. It does weigh 3, so it's not affected by Pack Rat 2, which is a little bit strange. And it doesn't have as much health as some of these other weapons that we've talked about. This one's actually decent in all honesty compared to a lot of other like melee and unarmed weapons. So I'm going to put it into the low end of C tier, but it's no higher than that. It's definitely not as good as like brass knuckles are. It's probably not as useful as the golden gloves are, at least if you are going for that fatigue status. The unique version is worth a little bit more. This is the Recompensance of the Fallen. This one you can get in Cottonwood Cove. You can just steal this inside the commander's building. I don't remember exactly what his name is, but it's inside the desk. You just go in there and grab it. This one also requires 0 unarmed and only 1 melee weapons. This one does a little bit more damage per hit, a little bit more damage per second, actually doing pretty decent damage per second, doing okay crit damage, having a 1-time crit modifier, still having high action point cost, and just having slightly higher health. This one I still usually don't use over something like brass knuckles, just because it's kind of out of the way to get, and I'm not grabbing it right away, and within the same amount of distance, I'm probably going to get some spike knuckles, which are just better than these. So this one I would also say is like C tier. It's higher than the regular Dog Tag Fist, but not that much higher. The Bladed Gauntlet, you can actually find these in some early game areas. Like you can find one that's always in the prison, I believe, that the Powder Gangers have taken over. If you open up the vault, you can get one there, or the wall safe. This one requires 25 unarmed and 5 strength, so it does require more strength than some of the other weapons we've talked about. This one does okay damage per hit, okay damage per second, actually pretty good crit damage, and has a 2x crit modifier, which is nice. And its action point costs are kind of okay. Its major downside, though, is that it weighs 10, which I guess could be an upside if you like the heavyweight perk, because then it would cut it down to 5, which isn't so bad. And it has low item health at only 60 health, so it will break kind of quick. But the Bladed Gauntlet, when you get it early on, it's decent. So I'm going to say that it's B tier, maybe above the brass knuckles, although I tend to use them more often than this. Then we have the unique version of it. This is the Cram Opener. This is the one that you can get from Little Buster, who's at Camp McCarran. He is trying to hunt down the fiends. Well, he's not. He's just sitting around complaining and saying that he will hunt down the fiends. And then once you kill him, he can attack you and you can kill him and take this from him, which is kind of nice. This one requires 25 unarmed and 5 strength as well. This one does a little bit higher damage per hit, a little bit higher damage per second, still has a 2x crit modifier, still does good crit damage, and has okay action point cost. It has slightly more health than the regular bladed gauntlet, and it still weighs 10, so heavyweight can cut this in half to 5. That's all okay. Everything about this weapon is just kind of an upgrade to the bladed gauntlet, so I'm going to put it B tier, but it's still not going to be better than like spike knuckles that you can get probably before you even get to Camp McCarran, so not a weapon that I use very often, but it's okay. And then we've got all of the gloves to talk about. And first up, we've got the Scientist Glove. You find all of these in Old World Blues. You can find them all around the map. At least the Scientist Glove you can. Certain ones you find in other areas, and we'll talk about that when we get to them. The Scientist Glove requires 25 unarmed and 2 strength. This one does okay damage per hit, okay damage per second. Actually has a 1.5 times crit modifier, but does very low crit damage at only 5. Has low action point cost, only weighs 2, so Pack Rat does affect it. And it has low item health. The Scientist Glove is probably what you're going to pick up and use, assuming you didn't bring anything to Old World Blues, and it kind of gets the job done, but it's definitely a C tier weapon. It's nothing really spectacular. Some of its unique variants are a bit better, and let's talk about each of them. First up, we have the Corrosive Glove, which the Corrosive Glove requires 55 unarmed. It's one of those weird weapons that Old World Blues has, and it requires 2 strength to wield. This one is the Green Glove. This one deals acid damage on it. This one also has okay damage per hit, okay damage per second, 1 times crit modifier, still low crit damage, but the acid gives you 2 damage, or 2 acid damage over 10 seconds, which is also still not weight great. It does have okay item health, and it doesn't weigh too much at 4, but the Corrosive Glove I don't ever really use in Old World Blues. It is kind of interesting looking, but this one I would also say is like C tier. It's higher up than the regular glove here, but not by too much, and I still probably wouldn't take it over something like Brass Knuckles if I just wanted to punch stuff. Then we've got the Red Glove, which is the Sanitizer Glove, and this one also requires 55 unarmed and 2 strength. This one does better damage per hit, better damage per second than the other gloves we've talked about, still has low crit damage and still regular crit modifier, but this one has fire on it, so when you punch something, you can light it on fire, which is kind of nice. This is one of the few unarmed weapons and one of the few weapons in the game that is affected by the Pyromaniac perk, which is pretty good. And if you have Pyromaniac, this one's not bad. If you don't have Pyromaniac, this one's still probably like C tier. But if you do, and I'm assuming you do, I'm going to put it up into B tier and be kind of generous with it. So we have a little bit of variation between the gloves here. Honestly, maybe I should just move the Brass Knuckles up to B tier, because they're kind of what I'm comparing all these to, and I think that it's still a bit better than them. So let's put Brass Knuckles up into B tier. Let's put them up here, and that'll make it a little bit easier for me to kind of go through the weapons that we do have, because we still have a lot of kind of crazy unarmed weapons. Up next, we have Dr. Klein's Glove. This is another blue glove. It actually has his name written on the side of it if you look down in first person, which is kind of funny. You can find this right at the very start of Old World Blues. It is in Dr. Klein's room, which is great. This one requires 45 unarmed, another weird amount, and 3 strength to wield effectively. This one does pretty decent damage per hit, pretty decent damage per second, has a 3 times crit modifier, although the crit damage is still extremely low. Action point cost is also quite low with these, which is nice. And this one also, when you hit something, reduces its strength, its damage threshold, and its energy weapons for a couple of seconds. Some of those are on regular hit, some of them are crit hit, so the extra crit damage does kind of help. Lowering damage threshold by 1 isn't a major advantage. Lowering their strength by 1 can help in melee fights. This one's just kind of okay as well. This one I would say is like B tier. It's better than these other gloves, but not by a ton. Then we have Dr. Mobius's glove, which you find in Dr. Mobius's Forbidden Zone. This one also requires a weird amount at 35 unarmed and 2 strength to wield. I don't know why all the gloves are kind of like this. This one does okay damage per hit, not as much as Klein's, does decent damage per second, has a 2 times crit modifier with low crit damage, extremely low action point cost. This one's not bad in a VATS build. And this one does have some unique effects where its crit has a knockback on it and it has a frenzy. So if you do get the frenzy, this might make it so enemies go and attack other enemies, which is pretty good for you. This one also reduces energy weapons and perception when you punch something, which reducing something's perception doesn't matter in combat. If you're punching them, they probably know that you're there. and reducing their energy weapons by a little bit might help against certain enemies. This one's also okay. I would say this one's B tier as well. It's nothing way crazy. It does have a weird particle effect on it when you punch stuff. Up next, we've got the Power Fist. And this one requires 50 unarmed and 5 strength to wield. So, decent amount. This one does pretty good damage per hit, pretty good damage per second, has an average crit modifier, has average crit damage or a little bit above average crit damage, has okay action point cost, has okay item health, and it doesn't weigh too much at 6. All around, the Power Fist is pretty decent. There is 2 versions of this, regular Power Fist that you can find just all over the Wasteland, and there is the Gunrunner's Arsenal version. With the Gunrunner's Arsenal version, it gets quite a bit better, where you can have the Power Fist Chrome Tubes, where you get 100% more health with the item. That is pretty good. You can also get High Capacity Valves, which gives you 8 more damage. That one's great. And you can also get the Ported Chamber, which increases your attack speed by 20%. Regular Power Fist, I would say, is probably like B tier. Gunrunner's Arsenal with everything on it, I would say is A tier, because this one is pretty solid all the way around. You're not going to be upset about getting a Power Fist, especially a Gunrunner's Arsenal one, and throwing some stuff onto it, where it can be quite a bit scarier. And speaking of something scarier, we have the unique versions of the Power Fist up next. First up is Salt Upon Wounds Power Fist. This you get at the end of Honest Hearts, and this one does have a unique effect dealing damage over time. So this one requires 50 unarmed and 6 strength, slightly more than the regular Power Fist. Does higher damage per hit, a little bit higher damage per second, still has that accumulated damage per second over time, has decent crit damage with an average crit modifier, and has okay action point cost. This one also weighs 6 and has decent item health. This one I would also say is A tier, maybe not even better than the Gunner's Arsenal version of the Power Fist, but still decent, and I do really like the way that it looks. I think it has a really cool color scheme to it. Then we have another unique version of the Power Fist, which is called Grease Lightning. This is in the Gunner's Arsenal DLC, so you do need to have that, and the Brotherhood sells this. The unique thing about this one is that it attacks much, much faster than a regular Power Fist, which makes it kind of crazy. This one also requires 50 unarmed and 5 strength. This one does okay damage per hit, but really high damage per second. Has an okay crit damage, has okay crit modifiers on it, has okay action points. It also weighs 6 just like the regular Power Fist, and it has a decent amount of health. I think Grease Lightning is probably our first S tier because the attack speed, the rate at which you can attack with this thing is kind of crazy. You can just pummel something into the ground super fast. Then we have kind of unique versions of the Power Fist with the Saturnite Fist and the superheated version of it. So the regular Saturnite Fist requires 45 unarmed and 4 strength. Again, it's a weird old world blues weapon that just requires weird amounts. This one does pretty good damage per hit, pretty good damage per second, has regular crit damage, regular crit modifier, action point cost is kind of low. It does attack faster than a regular Power Fist, which is nice, and this also only weighs 4, so it is more lightweight. It also has a little bit more item health than a Power Fist, unless you have the upgrade to it with the Gunner's Arsenal version, then they have the same. So this one is an easy A tier. This one's actually really good, and if you wanted to go into Old World Blues just completely naked, whatever you get you're going to use there, this is a really good option for an unarmed build. There's actually pretty good options in most of the DLCs for unarmed and melee builds. Up next we have the superheated version, which this one is even stronger because you can use the Pyromaniac perk with this and it gets really, really high damage. This one is also a weird amount at 55 unarmed and 5 strength. This one does really high damage per hit, really high damage per second, assuming you're running Pyromaniac with it. It has pretty decent crit damage with an average crit modifier, has okay action points, and its crit effect makes it so you can light things on fire. That's all pretty good. The only kind of downside to this one compared to the regular one is that it gets less overall item health. But other than that, it's just a straight upgrade to it. And again, if you have Pyromaniac, this one is an easy S tier. If you don't have Pyromaniac, it's still pretty good. Maybe not S tier, maybe A tier. But it's probably one of the best options for using Pyromaniac. This and the unique Shish Kebab, those are probably the main two. Although other weapons like the Flamer are pretty good too with it. Up next we have the Bear Trap Fist. This is a weapon that you get in Dead Money. This one you get in the Sierra Madre. A lot of the ghost people can have it. And this is the strongest weapon inside the Sierra Madre for dealing with the ghost people because it has the highest chance of dismembering them. So it makes an unarmed build extremely easy to go through that DLC compared to any other build. Even if you're not specifically running unarmed, this is still probably one of your strongest weapons for that DLC. This one requires 50 unarmed and 5 strength. This one does okay damage per hit, decent damage per second, average crit damage. Everything about this is kind of average besides it having the 2 times limb damage, which is pretty good. And again, for Dead Money, this thing is like easy S tier in that DLC. Outside of that DLC, the Bear Trap Fist is still okay, and I would say it's B tier. It's not bad to carry around. Next we have the Mantis Gauntlet. You can find these in a couple of places. Most of the time enemies don't have these. I don't know if any enemy actually has a Mantis Gauntlet. It seems like 1 or 2 do. I'm not entirely sure about that. You can buy them from the Great Khans too. Oh, and the White Lakes can carry them. That's where I've seen them before. I swear I'd seen other people use them. This one requires 75 unarmed and 4 strength, so that's kind of higher than some of the weapons we've talked about. It does pretty good damage per hit, pretty good damage per second, has a 3 times crit modifier, which is a big deal. Having decent crit damage and low action point cost. This one does weigh 10, so if you have heavyweight, this gets cut in half to 5, and this has even lower item health than something like the Bladed Gauntlet, which only had 60. This one only has 50. If you can keep this in good condition, if you have weapon repair kits, this one's probably like A tier. It's pretty solid all the way around. If you don't, it probably falls down a bit just because it's going to break fairly often, and these are fairly rare, so you're going to have to go to somebody to fix it up for you, or you're going to have jury rigging so that you can fix it with any of these other options. Then we have the unique version of it, which is the Embrace the Mantis King. This is a Gunrunner's Arsenal specific weapon. You buy this from Mick and Ralph's. This one also requires 75 unarmed and 4 strength, so same as the regular Mantis Gauntlet. This one does pretty good damage per hit, very high damage per second. This one also has a 3 times crit modifier with very high crit damage, so that's actually really good. This one does weigh 12 though, so you probably want to have heavyweight unless you're just carrying this one weapon around and you just plan on using jury rigging to fix it with all your other unarmed stuff, because it still has kind of low health, but heavyweight could cut it down to 6. This one is probably like S tier. This one is one of the strongest underrated weapons in New Vegas. I had heard that last time I was playing New Vegas when I was streaming it. And I do agree. The Embrace the Mantis King is very, very strong and does a lot of DPS, so it is a very nice weapon to have. Maybe not the strongest unarmed weapon, but I think it still belongs up into S tier, because once you do have a crit build and you're just smacking away with this, it does really high DPS. Up next we have the Yaoguai Gauntlet. You find these in Honest Hearts. The Sorrows have these, so if a Sorrow dies near you, you can pick this up off their body, and I believe that's kind of the only way you're going to get one of these. Or you kill the Sorrow and take it off of their body. This one requires 50 unarmed and 4 strength. This one does okay damage per hit, okay damage per second, has a 2.5 times crit modifier, which is pretty good, and decent crit damage. Its action point costs are low. The big advantage that this one has is that it completely ignores damage threshold and damage resist. It also has a lot of health. It has a ton of health, so it takes forever to break these things. They do weigh a lot at 10, but heavyweight can cut that in half to 5, and you only need to carry around one of these. It's actually a really, really strong weapon early on if you want to go to Honest Hearts right away, just because it ignores the armor. So I'm going to say that this one's probably like A tier. Then we have the unique version of it, which is She's Embrace. She's Embrace you have to get during a quest. You have to kill She, which is the giant flaming Yaoguai, once you take all of the chems that are given to you. Gotta be careful with wording here on YouTube. You kill the bear, you take its paw, then you can make this, or it's given to you at the end of the quest. This one also requires 50 unarmed and 4 strength. This one does better damage per hit, better damage per second, has a 3 times crit modifier, which is great. She's Embraced just like the regular Yaoguai Gauntlet. Also ignores damage threshold, which is a pretty big thing. And this one has even better health than it, coming in at 900. It takes forever for this thing to break. It does weigh 10 though, so heavyweight might be necessary. This one's pretty good though. This one I'm also going to say is A tier. I don't think it's quite the strongest for things that ignore damage threshold, which is why I'm putting it here and not S tier. However, I could totally understand people arguing this one for S tier, because ignoring damage threshold and damage resist is a pretty big deal, and having a weapon that basically is unbreakable is also just super nice. It's just a nice quality of life to have in a weapon. It's kind of the same thing with like this machine and why I consider that weapon so good. And let's go over the other claw. This is the Fist of Rar, or if you have Wild Wasteland, it's the Fist of the North Rar. NANI? That is an anime reference to Fist of the North Star, which is a pretty amazing anime from the 80s. If you haven't seen it and you're interested in very violent post-apocalyptic martial arts movies or series, or you just want something that's nostalgic from the 80s, I would actually highly recommend it. It actually has one of my favorite villains in it. Rar's Fist is kind of unique because you get it in the Lonesome Road and you actually have to make this, which makes it so you can actually sneak this into dead money if you want, because it counts as a quest item that cannot be taken away from you. That does give you an insanely strong weapon for dead money, and probably even stronger than the Bear Trap Fist, which is very strong by itself. This one requires 100 unarmed and 6 strength, so pretty high up there for the requirements. This does really high damage per hit, really high damage per second, has a 2 times crit modifier with very high crit damage on top of that. This is probably one of the strongest unarmed weapons in the game, and probably just one of the strongest weapons in the game in general. So the Fist of Rar, or the Fist of the North Rar, is going right up to the top of S tier. And speaking of the Lonesome Road, we also have the unique Power Fist, sort of. It's kind of unique. This is the Industrial Hand. This one requires 75 unarmed and 7 strength to wield, so it is on the heavier end and more strength required than some of our other weapons. This one is also pretty crazy because this one does good damage per hit, very high damage per second because this is just a chainsaw on the end of your hand, and just like the chainsaw, it also ignores damage threshold and damage resist, so it doesn't matter how big the enemy is, you're going to be hurting it regardless. Has an average crit modifier with low crit damage. It's actually much higher than you would expect for weapons like this because weapons like the chainsaw and the thermic lance, they don't really have crit damage. It's mostly just raw physical damage. This one actually has both, so it makes it even stronger. Action point cost is very high with this one though, just like those other weapons, so it's not really the best for a VATS build. This one also weighs 10, so you could cut it in half with heavyweight, take it down to 5. And this one has 1600 item health. Although this is a more of an automatic weapon that you just have to hold on something similar to the Ripper. It is way stronger than the Ripper though, and the Industrial Hand I would also put up in S tier. It is very, very strong for an unarmed build. Up next we have the Displacer Glove. The Displacer Glove is a pretty interesting weapon too. This one requires 100 unarmed and 4 strength to wield. This one does high damage per hit, pretty decent damage per second, not as high as some of our other weapons we've talked about. Has decent crit damage, has an okay crit modifier at 1 times, weighs a decent amount. This is basically just an upgrade to a Power Fist in a lot of ways, and for it, I think it's still belonging of A tier. I don't think it's way better than like a Power Fist, and maybe it's not even better than a fully modded out Power Fist or some of these other versions of it, but it's pretty decent overall. Then we have the unique version of it, which is Pushy. Pushy actually has one of the lowest strength requirements at only 2, which is pretty interesting because that makes it so every build could use it. It does require 100 unarmed though, and this one does do pretty good damage per hit, pretty good damage per second, has good crit damage, has an okay crit modifier, has okay action points, okay weight, okay health. This one I would say is also high up into A tier. I don't think it's quite S tier. I'm sure some people could argue it, especially with how readily accessible it is in terms of its stat line. So even if you wanted to go with a low strength build and put more points elsewhere, like into agility and into intelligence, maybe into endurance, this one would be a really good option for you. Then our next weapon is the Ballistic Fist. Have you ever wanted to punch something and shoot something at the same time? Well, the Ballistic Fist is for you. This one requires 100 unarmed and 9 strength, so it is a very hefty weapon, one of the heaviest or just one of the highest stat requirement weapons out of anything in the game. This one does really high damage per hit, pretty high damage per second because of that really high damage per hit. Has pretty good crit damage, coming in at 80 damage, which is very high. Average crit modifier, decent action point cost, still weighs 6, and it has okay item health. The Ballistic Fist is pretty strong just by itself. It can kind of out damage a lot of stuff just in terms of raw damage per hit, and it is very devastating even to the heaviest armed enemies. So I would say that the regular Ballistic Fist is actually on the low end of S tier. I think it's quite good. Then we have the unique version of it, which is called the Two-Step Goodbye. This is a Gunrunner's Arsenal specific weapon. You do buy this directly from the Gunrunners, and this one also requires 100 unarmed and 9 strength. Now this one actually does less damage per second, and less crit damage than the standard Ballistic Glove. Although it does have a 4 times crit modifier, which the crit chance is pretty important, because if you hit a crit with this, you deal more damage from the explosion, as well as if you get a kill with this, it puts a bomb on the enemy that you just killed, specifically on their torso if you rip them apart. Then this will go off and deal damage to everything in the area, which can include you sometimes. So breaking limbs can be kind of annoying, and I don't tend to take this weapon too much in the hardcore difficulty, just because you can't fix limbs easily if you don't have Hydra or Doctor's Bags or something else, one of the other items that actually heals up your limbs, which can be kind of rare. The Two-Step Goodbye, I would say, is also probably S tier. It's S tier in terms of fun, definitely, but in terms of usefulness, it is still really strong compared to the other weapons up here. And if you have a crit unarmed build, it is very good. If you're not going with that type of build, it's going to fall down a little bit. And again, if you're playing on hardcore difficulty, I could see people moving this down to A or B tier, just because, like, breaking your own limbs is kind of annoying at times. Then we have the Zap Glove. The Zap Glove is kind of a unique weapon that deals electricity damage, or at least it deals extra damage to robots and people in power armor, which can be pretty good. This one does okay damage per hit, okay damage per second, average crit damage, average crit modifier, okay action point costs. This one is definitely better against enemies in armor, or at least against non-power armor enemies and non-robot enemies. It still does decent enough damage, so I'd say this one's probably like A tier as well. I think it's pretty good. It's not like some of the other weapons, like the pulse gun or something, where it's just not good against anything but power armor. And then we have the unique version of it, which is the Paladin Toaster. This one requires 75 unarmed and 4 strength to wield. This one does higher damage per hit, higher damage per second, has higher crit damage, has the same crit modifier, deals also more damage towards robots and enemies with power armor. This one's usually the one I take over the Zap Glove just for punching enemies like that. So it's pretty good against those enemies, and it's probably like A or S tier. Against other enemies, it's still probably like A tier. It's pretty solid. As you can see here, Unarmed actually has a really good amount of weapons that are very, very strong. Even all these A tier weapons can be very, very strong in the right hands. And Unarmed, I feel, is kind of one of those skills that gets a little bit underplayed. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons. Not so much in New Vegas. In New Vegas, the unarmed weapons are quite strong. And tell me where you would put all of these weapons in New Vegas. I'd be really interested to hear that. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. I really do appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye!